93% of people misjudge quiet strength as weakness, and that single misunderstanding shapes how powerful individuals are treated, overlooked, or underestimated every day. She is often labeled as too calm, too distant, or too soft, not because she lacks power, but because her power doesn't perform for attention. The world has been conditioned to recognize strength only when it is loud, aggressive, and visible. So when someone operates from a place of deep awareness rather than reaction, it creates confusion. She doesn't rush to prove herself, she doesn't interrupt to be heard, and she doesn't compete for validation, which makes others uncomfortable because they cannot easily define her. What they fail to see is that her silence is not emptiness, it is discipline, it is observation, it is control. She has learned that reacting to everything drains energy, so she chooses carefully where her attention goes, and that alone sets her apart from the majority. Most people are driven by impulse, by the need to respond immediately, to defend, to explain, to justify, but she has outgrown that cycle. She understands that not every moment deserves a reaction, and not every opinion deserves a response. This level of awareness makes her unpredictable to those who rely on emotional reactions to feel in control. When someone cannot provoke you, cannot shake you, cannot make you break your composure, they lose their power over you, and that is what people sense in her, even if they cannot explain it. Her calm presence forces others to confront their own noise, their own insecurity, their own need for external validation, and that reflection is uncomfortable. So instead of trying to understand her, they label her. Misunderstanding becomes easier than self-awareness. She has spent time in silence, in reflection, in growth, and that journey has taught her something most people never learn. That power is not about being seen, it is about being aligned. She doesn't need to dominate a room to own it, because her energy speaks before she ever says a word. There is a quiet certainty in how she carries herself, a grounded confidence that does not fluctuate based on who is watching or who is approving, and that kind of stability is rare. People are used to energy that seeks attention, that demands recognition, that constantly tries to prove its worth. So when they encounter someone who simply exists in their truth without explanation, it disrupts their expectations. She is not trying to fit into anyone's idea of who she should be, and that independence makes her difficult to categorize. She listens more than she speaks, not because she has nothing to say, but because she understands the value of information. Every conversation, every interaction, every environment reveals something, and she pays attention to all of it. While others are focused on being heard, she is focused on understanding, and that gives her an advantage that cannot be easily matched. She is not naive, she is aware, and awareness changes how you move through the world. It teaches you when to engage and when to step back, when to trust and when to walk away, when to speak, and when silence is the most powerful response. This is why she is often misunderstood, because her strength does not follow the patterns people expect. It is not loud enough for those who equate volume with power, and it is not performative enough for those who seek constant reassurance. But that doesn't make her weak, it makes her rare, and rarity is often misunderstood. Before it is recognized, only about 12% of people operate from true internal validation, while the vast majority rely on external approval to feel confident, worthy, or secure, and that difference is exactly what separates quiet strength from fragile confidence. She no longer waits for applause to confirm her value, no longer looks around the room to see if she is being accepted before she allows herself to feel enough. There was a time when validation mattered, when being seen, liked, and chosen felt like proof of worth. But she outgrew that phase through experience, through disappointment, through realizing that approval is often inconsistent and conditional. She learned that when you build your identity on the opinions of others, you give them control over how you feel about yourself, and that is a dangerous place to live. So she made a shift, not overnight, but gradually, intentionally, choosing to define herself by her own standards rather than the expectations around her. Now, her confidence is not something that turns on and off depending on feedback. It is something stable, something grounded, something she carries regardless of who is watching. She doesn't chase compliments, she doesn't perform for recognition, and she doesn't shrink herself to fit into spaces that cannot recognize her depth. That kind of self-assurance can be intimidating, not because she is trying to overpower anyone, but because she cannot be easily influenced. When someone is not seeking approval, they become difficult to manipulate, difficult to control. And that shifts the dynamic in every interaction. People are used to giving validation as a form of leverage, as a way to create dependency, but she has removed that need entirely. She appreciates recognition, but she does not depend on it. And that distinction changes everything. It means she can walk away from situations that do not align with her values without hesitation, without second guessing, without needing reassurance that she is making the right choice. It means she can stand alone without feeling lonely, because her sense of worth is not tied to who stays or who leaves. Most people struggle with this because they have been conditioned to measure themselves through comparison, constantly looking at others to determine where they stand, constantly adjusting their behavior to maintain acceptance. She has stepped out of that cycle. She understands that comparison distorts reality, that it creates unnecessary pressure, and that it pulls you away from your own path. Instead, she focuses inward, on growth, on alignment, on becoming better than she was yesterday, rather than trying to be better than someone else today. This inward focus creates a different kind of strength, one that is not reactive, not fragile, not dependent on circumstances. It is quiet, but it is powerful because it is consistent. She doesn't need to announce her confidence. She doesn't need to prove it, because it shows in how she moves, in the decisions she makes, in the boundaries she sets without apology. She knows when to say no without explaining, when to walk away without creating a scene, when to remain silent instead of engaging in something that drains her energy. That restraint is not weakness, it is mastery. It takes strength to hold your ground without raising your voice, to trust your path without needing constant reassurance, to believe in your worth without requiring others to confirm it. And that is what makes her different. She is not driven by the need to be validated, she is driven by the need to be aligned. And alignment creates a level of confidence that cannot be shaken by opinions, rejection, or temporary setbacks. When someone reaches that point, they become steady in a world that is constantly shifting, and that steadiness becomes their power. Nearly 90% of communication is nonverbal, yet most people still focus only on words, missing the subtle signals that reveal truth, intention, and emotion beneath the surface. And that gap is where her awareness sets her apart. She doesn't just listen to what is being said, she pays attention to what is avoided, what is delayed, what is inconsistent. While others take things at face value, she reads between the lines, noticing shifts in tone, changes in energy, patterns in behavior that repeat over time. This is not overthinking, it is trained awareness, built from experience, from moments where she once ignored her intuition and paid the price. She learned that truth rarely announces itself loudly. It shows up quietly in details most people overlook. A pause that feels too long, a response that doesn't match the situation, an energy that feels slightly off, even when the words sound right. These are the signals she trusts. Most people are too distracted to notice these things, too focused on reacting, on responding quickly, on being heard, but she takes a step back. She observes first, processes second, and responds last. And that order changes everything. It gives her clarity in situations where others feel confused. It gives her control in moments where others feel overwhelmed. She understands that people often reveal more through their patterns than their promises. And once you start paying attention to patterns, you begin to see the truth without needing explanations. This awareness makes her difficult to deceive, not because she assumes the worst, but because she recognizes inconsistency. When words and actions don't align, she doesn't ignore it, she takes note. She doesn't confront everything immediately, she doesn't react impulsively, but she stores the information, she connects the dots, and over time, the full picture becomes clear. That clarity gives her an advantage that cannot be easily replicated, because it is not based on guesswork, it is based on observation. While others are caught in cycles of confusion, asking why things don't make sense, she already understands what is happening beneath the surface. This doesn't make her cold, it makes her aware. It allows her to move with intention instead of impulse, to choose her actions based on truth rather than assumption. She knows when to invest her energy and when to withdraw it, when to trust and when to create distance. Most people wait for obvious signs before they act, but by the time something becomes obvious, it is often too late. She doesn't wait for certainty, she trusts subtlety. She understands that small details, repeated over time, reveal more than grand gestures ever could. This is why she rarely gets caught off guard. It is not because life is predictable, but because she is paying attention in a way most people are not. Her awareness also changes how others experience her. People feel seen around her, sometimes in ways that make them uncomfortable, because she notices what they try to hide. She picks up on insecurity behind confidence, on hesitation behind certainty, on intention behind words, and that level of perception can feel exposing to those who are not used to being understood without explanation. She doesn't need long conversations to understand someone's character. She watches how they act under pressure, how they treat others when there is nothing to gain, how consistent they are when no one is watching. These are the things that reveal truth, and she focuses on them. While others are distracted by surface-level impressions, she is tuned into depth. That depth allows her to navigate relationships, environments, and decisions with a level of precision that others struggle to achieve. She is not easily influenced by appearances, not easily convinced by empty words, not easily swayed by temporary emotions. She sees beyond the obvious, beyond the immediate, beyond what is presented, and that vision gives her power that doesn't need to be announced, because it shows in the choices she makes and the situations she avoids over. 70% of people stay longer than they should in situations that drain them simply because they are waiting for closure, for one final conversation, one clear explanation, one moment that makes everything make sense, and that waiting keeps them stuck far beyond what is healthy or necessary. She no longer lives in that cycle. She understands that closure is not something always given. It is something created, something decided internally rather than received externally. There was a time when unanswered questions kept her awake, when silence felt louder than words, when she replayed conversations, trying to find meaning in what was never clearly said. But experience taught her that not every ending comes with clarity, and not every person has the emotional awareness or honesty to provide the answers she once searched for. So she made a shift, a powerful one, where she stopped chasing explanations and started trusting patterns. When actions contradict words, when effort becomes inconsistent, when respect is no longer present, she doesn't wait for confirmation, she accepts what is already being shown. That acceptance gives her freedom, because she is no longer dependent on someone else's willingness to explain themselves. Most people delay their exit because they want certainty, they want a clear reason they can hold on to, something that justifies their decision. But she understands that the absence of clarity is often clarity itself. Silence, inconsistency, and distance are all forms of communication, even when they are not spoken directly. She listens to those signals instead of ignoring them, and that allows her to act sooner rather than later. Walking away without closure does not mean she doesn't care. It means she cares enough about herself to stop waiting for something that may never come. It means she values her time, her energy, and her peace more than she values temporary comfort. Because staying in confusion just to avoid discomfort is a slow form of self-betrayal, and she has learned not to betray herself for the sake of understanding someone else. This level of detachment is often misunderstood. People assume that if you can walk away without a final conversation, without a dramatic ending, without demanding answers, then you must be cold or unaffected. But the truth is the opposite. It takes strength to leave without closure, because it requires you to sit with unanswered questions and still choose yourself. It requires you to accept that you may never fully understand why something happened the way it did, and to be at peace with that uncertainty. Most people avoid that feeling. They delay their decisions. They keep doors open just in case clarity arrives. But she closes doors when she recognizes misalignment, not when she receives permission to move on. That is what makes her different. She doesn't need a perfect ending to begin a new chapter. She doesn't need someone to validate her experience before she honors it. She trusts what she feels, even when it is not fully explained, and that trust becomes her guide. When something feels off consistently, she doesn't ignore it, hoping it will fix itself. She acknowledges it and adjusts her direction. This is not impulsive behavior, it is intentional movement based on awareness. She understands that waiting for closure often keeps people attached to situations that have already ended in every meaningful way except physically. So instead of holding on, she releases. Instead of overanalyzing, she decides. Instead of seeking answers, she creates them by choosing to move forward. And in doing so, she reclaims control over her life. Because the moment you stop needing closure from others is the moment you stop giving them power over your ability to move on. And that shift changes everything about how you experience endings and beginnings. Nearly 80% of stress-related struggles come from environments and relationships people tolerate for too long, not because they don't recognize the damage, but because they feel obligated to explain, to fix, or to negotiate their boundaries until they are understood. She no longer lives that way. She has learned that peace is not something you ask for, it is something you protect, something you prioritize without needing permission or agreement from anyone else. There was a time when she tried to make everyone comfortable, when she adjusted her boundaries to avoid conflict, when she believed that if she just explained herself clearly enough, people would understand and respect her limits. But experience showed her that not everyone is willing to understand, and more importantly, not everyone is meant to have access to her energy at the same level. That realization changed how she moves. She stopped negotiating her peace with people who only valued her when she was convenient, when she was available, when she was easy to access without limits. Now she chooses differently. She recognizes that every environment carries a certain energy, and not all energy is meant to be entertained. When something feels heavy, draining, or misaligned, she doesn't try to fix it. She doesn't try to force harmony where there is none. She simply creates distance. Most people struggle with this because they associate distance with loss, with rejection, with failure, but she sees it as alignment. She understands that protecting her peace is not about avoiding people. It is about choosing what she allows into her space. And that choice requires discipline. It requires the ability to say no without over-explaining, to step back without guilt, to prioritize her well-being even when others do not agree with her decisions. People often expect access to remain the same regardless of how they show up, but she no longer accepts that. She adjusts her presence based on consistency, respect, and intention. If those things change, her boundaries change too. This is not reactive behavior, it is responsive awareness. She is not trying to control others, she is controlling what she allows herself to experience. And that distinction is what gives her power. When you stop trying to manage how others behave and start managing what you tolerate, everything shifts. She doesn't argue for peace anymore, she embodies it. She doesn't stay in conversations that drain her, she exits them. She doesn't remain in environments that disrupt her clarity, she removes herself from them. And she does it without needing to create a scene, without needing to prove a point, without needing validation for her decision. That quiet exit, that calm withdrawal, is often more powerful than any explanation she could give, because it shows that she values her internal state more than external approval. Most people wait until they are overwhelmed before they act. They allow stress to build, they ignore early signs of discomfort, and by the time they decide to create boundaries, they're already exhausted. She doesn't wait for that point. She pays attention early. She notices when her energy shifts, when her mood changes after certain interactions, when something consistently feels off, and she responds before it escalates. This proactive awareness allows her to maintain stability in a world that often feels chaotic. Her peace is not fragile because it is actively maintained. It is not dependent on perfect circumstances, it is built on intentional choices. She understands that peace is not something you find once and keep forever. It is something you protect daily through the standards you set and the boundaries you enforce. And because of that, she is no longer easily disturbed. Situations that would once pull her into stress no longer have the same effect because she has changed how she responds. She has removed the need to explain herself to those who are committed to misunderstanding her, and that alone has freed a significant amount of her energy. When you stop negotiating your peace, you stop inviting chaos into your life, and that shift creates a level of clarity and stability that most people spend years trying to find. Only about 10% of people reach a level of self-awareness where their identity is internally defined rather than socially constructed. And that rare clarity is what allows her to move through the world without the need to constantly explain, justify, or prove who she is. There was a time when she felt the pressure to be understood by everyone, when she believed that if people misunderstood her, it meant she needed to speak more, clarify more, adjust more. But over time, she realized that constant explanation is often a sign of misalignment, not communication. The right people don't require endless clarification. They recognize consistency, they understand energy, they see truth through actions. That realization changed everything. She stopped trying to translate herself into forms that others could easily accept, and instead chose to stand firmly in who she already was. This doesn't mean she became closed off or distant. It means she became clear. Clear about her values, clear about her boundaries, clear about what she will and will not tolerate. And when you have that level of clarity, you don't feel the need to over-explain your decisions because they already make sense to you. Most people struggle with this because their identity is heavily influenced by external feedback. They adjust based on opinions, they shift based on expectations, they reshape themselves to maintain approval. That constant adjustment creates confusion, not just for others, but within themselves. She has stepped out of that cycle. She no longer looks outside for confirmation of who she is, she looks within. And that internal reference point gives her a stability that cannot be easily shaken. When someone questions her choices, she doesn't immediately feel the need to defend them. When someone misunderstands her, she doesn't rush to correct every assumption. She understands that not every perspective needs to be changed, and not every misunderstanding needs to be resolved. This level of detachment is not indifference, it is confidence. It is the understanding that her identity is not fragile. It does not need constant reinforcement. It does not collapse under differing opinions. People often expect explanations because they are used to uncertainty. When someone is unsure of themselves, they tend to over-communicate in an attempt to gain approval or avoid rejection. But she operates differently. Her actions are aligned with her beliefs, and that alignment speaks louder than any explanation ever could. She doesn't need to announce her standards, she lives them. She doesn't need to convince others of her worth, she embodies it. And over time, that consistency builds a reputation that words cannot replace. People begin to understand her not because she explains herself, but because she shows up the same way repeatedly. That reliability creates trust, even if it is not immediately recognized. There is also a certain level of peace that comes with no longer needing to be understood by everyone. It removes the pressure to perform, to constantly manage how you are perceived, to adjust your identity to fit different environments. She can enter any space as herself without calculating how she needs to behave to be accepted. And that freedom is powerful. It allows her to focus on what truly matters rather than being distracted by perception. Most people spend a significant amount of energy trying to control how others see them, but she has redirected that energy inward, toward growth, toward alignment, toward becoming more of who she already is, rather than trying to become what others expect. This shift changes how she experiences life. Decisions become easier because they are based on internal clarity rather than external pressure. Relationships become more authentic because they are built on truth rather than performance. And challenges become more manageable because her sense of self remains stable regardless of circumstances. When you know exactly who you are, you don't feel the need to constantly prove it. And that quiet certainty becomes one of the most powerful forms of presence a person can carry.